Jake Thompson had always been a man of the mountains. For 30 winters he lived alone in a small cabin deep in the wilderness, far away from anyone. He was a quiet man, not one for much company. His life had become a routine, one that involved only the essentials: waking up when the sun rose, chopping wood for heat, hunting to fill his stomach, and reading the books he had brought with him. He had no need for anything else, or so he thought. The mountain was his refuge, a place where the noise of the world couldn't reach him. He had turned away from society after a deep loss, something that still haunted him to this day. It had been years, decades even, since he left the world behind, but the pain of that past never really left. Instead, it stayed buried, and the mountains became his shelter. It was easier to be alone than to face what he had lost. Jake's cabin was simple but enough for him. It had a small fireplace to keep the chill out, a bed that was more a place to sleep than to rest, and a few belongings he couldn't part with: a worn-out chair, a table, and, of course, his books. The books had become his only link to the world outside. He'd read them over and over, though they were beginning to feel as old and worn as the life he led. Yet somehow he never got tired of them. They filled the silence in his cabin, but even they couldn't fill the emptiness that sometimes crept into his heart. The winters were harsh, especially in the remote part of the mountains where Jake lived. The snow would fall relentlessly, burying the world in a blanket of white. The wind would howl and scream, sometimes so loud it felt like the very mountain itself was alive. Yet Jake didn't mind the weather. It was what he had come to know and accept. His cabin was sturdy enough to survive the worst of it, and his work kept him busy. The days blurred together, one after the other, each indistinguishable from the last. For a long time, Jake didn't even think about the outside world. He had everything he needed: his tools, his firewood, his food stores, and his books. What more could he ask for? There were no visitors, no distractions. The only thing that reminded him he was still a part of the world was the occasional memory that slipped into his thoughts. A laugh, a face, the sound of a voice that seemed to echo from the past, but he'd pushed it all aside. It was easier that way. As the years passed, however, things began to change. It was subtle at first, a thought here or there, a fleeting moment of doubt. Was this the life he had always wanted? Was this really all there was? Jake had convinced himself he was content. The silence was his friend, the isolation his companion. But deep down, something began to stir. The days became longer, the winters colder, and the nights felt lonelier. It wasn't the cold that bothered him. It was the quiet. Sometimes, when he sat by the fire staring into the flames, Jake would wonder what life was like beyond the mountain. He remembered the town he had left behind, a small place with a few buildings, some farms, and a handful of people. He remembered the voices, the sounds of laughter, the feeling of being part of something. But that part of him seemed like a distant memory, as if it had happened to someone else. The years had made it harder to remember the warmth of those days. Still, he wasn't ready to return. The mountain had become his home. It was the only place where he felt safe, where he didn't have to answer to anyone. The thought of facing the world again, of dealing with people and their expectations, seemed impossible. He had been away for so long, and the idea of stepping back into that life was a daunting one. Besides, the mountain had a way of keeping him busy. There was always work to be done, always something to fix or prepare for the long winter ahead. Yet, as the years wore on, Jake began to feel something else, a sense of unease, a feeling that maybe he had been running from something for too long. It was a feeling that came in waves, washing over him when he least expected it. He would find himself standing by the window of his cabin, looking out over the snow-covered peaks, wondering what lay beyond. Was there something more? He didn't know, but the thought lingered in his mind like a distant whisper. The winters were always the hardest. The snow would pile up, sometimes as high as the roof, and the wind would rattle the cabin walls. Jake had learned to keep busy during these times. He'd chop wood, tend to the fire, fix whatever needed fixing, and sometimes, when the storm was especially fierce, he'd sit by the fire and read. But there was always a sense of isolation that he couldn't escape. It wasn't the physical distance from others that bothered him. It was the emotional distance. He had cut himself off from the world so completely that now it seemed impossible to reconnect. The first sign of change came during one particularly fierce storm. Jake had been chopping firewood outside when the wind picked up, and the snow began to fall harder than usual, It wasn't unusual for the weather to turn bad so suddenly, but this time something felt different. The air felt heavier, the snow thicker, as if the very mountain was closing in on him. For a moment, Jake stopped chopping and looked out into the swirling white. It was then that he heard it, a sound that cut through the wind. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible. But then it came again, louder this time. A knock, a soft, tentative knock, as if someone was trying to get his attention. Jake froze, his axe still in his hand. His heart skipped a beat. He hadn't had a visitor in years. No one came this far into the mountains. It was too dangerous, too remote, so who could be knocking at his door? He didn't move at first, unsure if he had heard correctly. But then the knock came again, and more insistent this time. The sound of someone or something outside in the storm. Jake's mind raced. Who could it be? A lost traveler? A passing hunter? He wasn't sure, but he knew one thing for certain. No one ever came here. Not in all the years he had been living alone. And yet there it was. A knock at the door. For a long moment, Jake stood there, paralyzed by confusion and disbelief. What did this mean? What was happening? The knock came once more, louder now, shaking him from his trance. Without thinking, he dropped the axe and hurried back to the cabin, his breath heavy in his chest. As he approached the door, his mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. He opened the door slowly, his hand trembling as he gripped the handle. And there, standing in the snow, was a woman. She looked exhausted, pale and covered in dirt and snow. Her eyes were wide, her hands clutching her stomach. She was pregnant, Jake noticed with a jolt. She looked like she had been walking for days. The woman stepped inside, her breath misting in the cold air. She was shaking, her clothes soaked through with snow, and Jake quickly closed the door behind her, shutting out the wind and the storm. Her eyes were wide with exhaustion, but there was something about them, a desperation, a plea for help that Jake couldn't ignore. He motioned for her to sit by the fire, gesturing to the small chair next to the hearth. As she sat down, she pulled her cloak tighter around her body, trying to gather whatever warmth the fire could provide. "Are you all right?" Jake asked, his voice a bit rough from the shock of the encounter. He hadn't spoken to anyone in months, and now, there she was. A stranger. Someone who had knocked at his door in the middle of a blizzard. The woman nodded slowly, though it was clear she was struggling. Her cheeks were flushed with cold and her breath came in shallow gasps. Jake could see that she was tired, but she wasn't yet ready to speak. He grabbed a blanket from the nearby cupboard and draped it over her shoulders, then set about preparing some food. The cabin was small, but it was enough for one man, and now, it seemed, enough for two. The crackling fire seemed to settle the atmosphere, and after a few moments of silence, the woman spoke. "My name is Sarah," she said quietly. I've been traveling for days. I got lost in the storm." Jake nodded, not sure what to say. He had no idea why she had ended up so far out in the mountains. Most people wouldn't dare venture this far unless they had no other choice. The paths were treacherous, especially during winter. It was hard to understand how someone could find their way here, especially a pregnant woman. But Jake didn't ask. Instead, he focused on warming up some soup he had left in a pot. "Where are you from?" he asked, trying to keep the conversation going. "Not far," she replied, her voice faint. "I left a place. I had to go." Jake raised an eyebrow. He could tell there was more to her story, but he didn't press. She was clearly exhausted, and he didn't want to push her further. For a long time, there was nothing but the sound of the fire crackling and the wind howling outside. As Jake set the food down in front of her, Sarah took a moment to stare at the bowl. She looked like she hadn't eaten in days. Her hands trembled as she lifted the spoon and took a slow, careful sip. Jake watched her for a while, then turned to gather a blanket for the couch. "You should rest," he said after a few moments. "There's a bed over there if you need it." Sarah didn't respond right away. She was still looking at the food like she was lost in thought. Finally, she set the spoon down, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand. "Thank you," she said softly, looking up at Jake. "I didn't know where else to go. The storm. I thought I wouldn't make it." Jake simply nodded. His cabin was the closest shelter for miles, and he wasn't about to turn her away. He was a solitary man, but something about Sarah's presence felt different. There was an urgency in her eyes, something that spoke to him in ways he didn't understand. "You're safe here," Jake said quietly. "I don't get many visitors, but you're welcome to stay as long as you need." Sarah gave a small, tired smile. It was a weak smile, but it was a smile nonetheless. She seemed grateful, though still unsure. After a few more moments, she let out a deep sigh and rested back in the chair. "I don't know what to do," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't plan this. I never planned for this." Jake didn't ask her to explain further. It wasn't his place to pry, but he could sense the weight of her words. She was in trouble, that much was clear. She had come here not just for shelter, but because she was desperate for something more. Perhaps for safety or for peace. "Rest now," Jake said again, this time a little firmer. "We'll figure it out tomorrow. You can't go anywhere in this storm." Sarah nodded, gratefully wrapping the blanket around herself. Jake gave her one last look before he went about his own nightly routine. There was little else to do now, and his mind was swirling with questions. Who was this woman? Why had she come all this way? And how had she ended up so far from anywhere? He couldn't help but wonder about her story, but he wasn't one to press. There were things about himself that he'd kept hidden for years. Maybe she had her own secrets. As Jake lay in bed that night, he found himself restless. He couldn't help thinking about Sarah. What had driven her to travel in such a dangerous part of the mountains? What had she been running from? But in the end, he couldn't answer these questions. The silence of the cabin was thick with uncertainty, and as much as he wanted to sleep, his mind kept racing. The fire had died down, but the wind outside howled louder than ever, as though the mountain itself was whispering something Jake couldn't understand. By morning, the storm had not let up. The snow was thick, the wind relentless, and the cabin felt colder than usual. Jake woke to the sound of Sarah moving about, a soft shuffle of footsteps across the floor. She was awake, and from the looks of it, she wasn't going anywhere soon. He got up and started stoking the fire, then turned to offer her breakfast. She was sitting by the fire, her eyes far away, lost in her own thoughts. The air between them was filled with a quiet understanding. There were no words needed. "You should eat," Jake said, placing a steaming bowl in front of her. "We'll see how the storm settles today. Maybe tomorrow we can figure out what to do." Sarah nodded but didn't say anything for a long while. The silence between them was thick, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Jake had grown used to the quiet, to the solitude of the mountain. But now with Sarah in his cabin, the silence felt different. It was as if the world outside had been momentarily forgotten, and all that mattered was this moment. The storm, the cold, the isolation, all of it was on pause just for a while. She took a bite of the food, and for the first time since her arrival, there was a sense of peace in her. Jake couldn't help but feel that in some strange way, they had both found something in each other, something they didn't know they were looking for. The storm raged outside, the wind howling through the trees and shaking the walls of the cabin. It was as if nature itself was trying to test the strength of the little shelter Jake had built for himself. The snow kept piling up, thick and heavy, trapping the world beyond his door. Inside, the warmth of the fire crackled, offering comfort and safety. The cabin had always been Jake's sanctuary, but now, with Sarah there, it felt different. It was no longer just a place of solitude. It was a space that held the possibility of connection. Sarah sat quietly by the fire, her eyes flicking occasionally toward the window where the snow blurred the view of the world outside. She seemed lost in thought, her fingers absently fiddling with the blanket she had wrapped around her. Jake noticed how tired she looked, her face pale and drawn, but there was something else in her eyes, a kind of uncertainty, as if she was unsure of what to do next. Jake had been watching her for a while, wondering about her story. He wanted to ask more questions, to know where she came from and why she had ended up so far from civilization, but he held back. He wasn't the type to pry into other people's lives, especially when they were in need of shelter. Still, the silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was just a quiet understanding, as if both of them were waiting for something, an answer, a moment of clarity, or perhaps simply the passing of the storm. After a long while, Sarah finally broke the silence. "I didn't know where else to go," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Her eyes were fixed on the fire as if the flames held some kind of comfort. "I didn't have anyone left to turn to." Jake said nothing at first. He didn't want to push her, but he could tell that she needed to say something, to explain herself in some way. Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning, and Jake felt an unspoken pull to listen. I was married," Sarah continued, her voice cracking slightly. To someone who didn't care about me. I thought I could make it work, that I could be happy, but it was always so hard. And then I found out I was pregnant. She stopped for a moment, taking a deep breath as if trying to steady herself. Jake remained quiet, allowing her the space to speak. It wasn't easy for her, he could tell. She was vulnerable and he didn't want to make her feel exposed. When I told him about the baby, Sarah said, her voice faltering, he didn't care. He didn't want me to have it. He didn't want to be a father. I knew then that I couldn't stay. I had to leave, but I didn't know where to go. So I ran. I thought maybe I could make it somewhere, anywhere, but I got lost. The storm came in so quickly and I couldn't find my way. Her words hung in the air, and for a moment Jake was at a loss for what to say. He could hear the pain in her voice, the ache of having been abandoned when she needed someone the most. He understood more than she realized. There were times in his own life when he felt like he was running from something, though he had never spoken of it to anyone. Maybe that was why he felt a sense of understanding, even a connection with Sarah. He knew what it was like to be alone, to feel like the world had turned its back on you. I'm sorry, Jake said quietly, his voice low and sincere. I didn't know. I can't imagine what that must have been like. Sarah shook her head, her eyes still focused on the fire. It's not your fault, she said softly. I didn't know what else to do. I thought I was going to die out there in the snow, but then I saw your cabin and, I don't know, something told me to knock. I don't even know why I came here, but I'm so glad I did. Jake felt a strange wave of relief wash over him. She had found her way to him, to this little cabin in the middle of nowhere, and now she was safe, or at least as safe as she could be. The storm outside would eventually pass, and with it, whatever fear Sarah had been carrying. For the first time in a long while, Jake felt like maybe he wasn't alone after all. Maybe there was still room for people in his life, even after all the years he had spent pushing them away. I'm glad you came too, Jake said, his voice steady. He had no idea how long Sarah would stay, or what would happen when the storm cleared, but in that moment all he could offer was the warmth of his cabin and the quiet companionship they shared. As the hours passed, Sarah seemed to settle more into the cabin, her body slowly recovering from the long trek through the snow. Jake kept the fire stoked and offered her more food, though she didn't eat much. She seemed content to simply sit, her thoughts drifting. But every now and then she would glance over at Jake, a flicker of gratitude in her eyes. It was a small thing, but it meant a lot to him. Later that evening, when the storm had not yet let up, Jake decided to venture outside to check the woodpile. The snow had continued to fall heavily, and it was becoming harder to see through the thick curtain of white. He grabbed his coat, and as he stepped outside, the cold bit into his skin, but he didn't mind. The crisp air felt refreshing, a sharp contrast to the stifling warmth inside. He moved quickly, gathering the firewood he needed before returning to the cabin. When he re-entered, Sarah was still by the fire, though her eyes were now closed. She had fallen asleep, her head resting against the back of the chair. The sight of her resting so peacefully made Jake feel a strange sense of pride. It wasn't often that he had someone to care for, and though he hadn't asked for this responsibility, it felt right. He quietly stoked the fire, adding more logs to keep it burning brightly. Jake sat down across from Sarah, watching her sleep for a moment. He thought about what she had said, how she had come to him in her time of need, how she had found refuge here, in this cabin that had always been his retreat. He wondered if this was fate, or if it was just a twist of coincidence. Either way, he knew one thing for sure. She was safe for now, and that was all that mattered. As the night wore on, the storm outside began to subside, but the snow continued to fall. The cabin was quiet, the only sound being the crackling of the fire and the steady rhythm of Sarah's breathing. Jake finally closed his eyes, the weight of the day settling on his shoulders, but he didn't feel burdened. For the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of peace. Tomorrow would come and the storm would pass. But for tonight, there was only the warmth of the fire, the quiet presence of another soul in his cabin, and the knowledge that sometimes, even in the harshest of winters, unexpected connections could be made. The next morning, the storm had slowed to a steady snowfall, the wind no longer howling as it had the night before. The mountain was quiet, covered in a thick layer of snow that stretched endlessly in every direction. Jake had spent the night thinking about Sarah's story, her sudden arrival, and the unexpected bond that had begun to form between them. He hadn't expected this, hadn't expected to have someone in his life again, especially not in such a vulnerable situation. Sarah had slept soundly through the night, her body finally finding rest after days of travel. She looked peaceful now, her face soft and relaxed in a way that made Jake feel like she had left the heavy burdens of the world behind, at least for the moment. He made coffee over the fire, the smell filling the cabin, and after a while Sarah began to stir, her eyes fluttering open. She blinked in the soft light of morning, and for a moment, her expression was blank, as if she was trying to piece together where she was. When she saw Jake sitting across from her, his hands wrapped around a steaming mug, she smiled faintly, though there was still a tiredness in her eyes. "Good morning," Jake said quietly, nodding toward the fire. "I made some coffee. You should drink something warm." Sarah sat up slowly, taking in the quiet of the cabin, the soft crackling of the fire, the warmth that filled the room. She had been through so much, and the comfort of this little cabin in the middle of nowhere felt almost surreal. She had been running for so long, and now, for the first time in a while, she could relax. The anxiety that had gripped her the night before seemed to have lessened, even if just a little. "Thank you," she replied, her voice still hoarse but filled with gratitude. She slowly accepted the mug from Jake and took a sip. The warmth of the coffee seemed to settle into her bones, and she let out a deep breath. It was a small comfort, but it was something she hadn't had in days. For a while, neither of them spoke. The silence in the cabin was comfortable now, different from the uneasy quiet that had filled the air the night before. Jake looked out the window, watching the snow fall gently as if the world was at peace for once. It was strange, though, this stillness that had taken over his cabin. It felt foreign to him, like an intrusion. He had gotten so used to being alone that having another person there, especially someone in need, made him feel like he had to adjust to this new reality. He didn't know what to do next. The storm had passed, but Sarah couldn't leave in her condition. The snow outside was still deep and the path was treacherous. Besides, she was pregnant. She couldn't travel far, not in the state she was in. Jake had lived alone for so long that he wasn't used to taking care of anyone, but now with Sarah there, it felt like his life had shifted. The cabin, once a quiet place of solitude, was now a shared space, a place where he found himself caring for another human being, and that felt strange, yet right at the same time. "Do you need anything?" Jake asked, breaking the silence. He looked at Sarah, unsure of what she might need, but feeling compelled to offer. "Anything I can do for you?" Sarah looked up at him, her eyes searching his face for a moment before she spoke. "I don't know," she said softly. "I didn't expect to end up here with you, but I'm grateful. I don't know what I would have done if I hadn't found your cabin." Jake nodded. He didn't have the right words to offer, but he understood what she meant. There was something unspoken between them, a sense of relief that they had found each other in the storm, as if fate had pushed them together when they both needed it the most. "I'm glad you found me too," Jake said quietly. He took a sip of his coffee, his eyes drifting back to the window. "It's not much, but you're welcome here. We'll figure things out." Sarah smiled faintly, and for a brief moment Jake thought he saw a flicker of peace in her eyes. But it quickly faded, replaced by the same uncertainty that had been there before. She set her coffee mug down and turned her gaze to the fire. I don't know what to do now," she admitted, her voice tinged with frustration. "I thought I had a plan, but everything changed. I thought I could run away and start fresh, but now I'm stuck." Jake understood her frustration. He knew what it was like to feel like you had no control over your life, to be stuck in a situation that felt like it was spiraling out of your hands. He had his own reasons for seeking refuge in the mountains, reasons he had never shared with anyone. The loss that had led him here, the pain he had carried with him for so many years. It had all built up over time, and now it was easier to be alone. But Sarah was different. She had come into his life at a time when he least expected it, and he couldn't just turn his back on her. "You're not stuck," Jake said gently. "You've made it here. You can rest, take your time, and figure things out. You don't have to make any decisions right now." Sarah glanced at him, her eyes searching for something in his expression. She nodded slowly, though there was still a deep uncertainty there. "I just don't know what to do next," she repeated softly, her voice breaking. Jake stood up and walked over to the small table, picking up a piece of wood from the pile next to the fireplace. "You don't have to know right now," he said. "We'll take it one day at a time. The snow's still deep out there. You're safe here. I'll make sure you're taken care of." For a moment, Sarah said nothing. She just stared into the fire, the warmth from the flames casting a soft glow on her face. Jake could sense the weight of her thoughts, the burden she carried. She had left behind everything, a life, a relationship, a home, in search of something better. And now here she was in a strange cabin in the middle of a snowstorm, unsure of what her future held. "I don't know how to thank you," Sarah said quietly, her voice full of emotion. "You didn't have to let me in. You didn't have to take care of me." Jake looked at her, his expression serious but kind. "You don't need to thank me. Just rest and we'll figure it out." It was then that Sarah seemed to let go of the tension in her shoulders, a deep breath escaping her. She smiled faintly, though it was a small smile. It was as if a weight had been lifted, even if just a little. As the days passed, the snow outside began to melt, the storm finally clearing. But for Sarah, the time inside the cabin had become a respite, a brief moment of peace in a life that had been filled with turmoil. And for Jake, it was the first time in years that he had felt like he was part of something again. They didn't have all the answers, but for now they had each other. And in that simple fact, there was a kind of healing that neither of them had expected. The quiet connection between them grew over the next few days. They worked together, tending to the fire, making sure the cabin was stocked with food and sharing stories of their pasts, each of them slowly opening up to the other in ways they hadn't done in years. And for the first time, Jake realized that maybe the world outside wasn't as distant as he had always believed. Sometimes all it took was a knock at the door to change everything. The days had started to stretch longer, the light of the late winter sun reaching farther into the cabin with each passing morning. The storm that had once raged outside had finally settled into a soft, steady snowfall, but the cold still lingered in the air, reminding both Jake and Sarah of the harsh world outside. Inside, however, the warmth of the fire and the growing bond between them made the cabin feel like a haven. Jake had gotten used to having Sarah around. She was no longer just a stranger who had knocked on his door in the middle of a blizzard. Over the past few days, they had begun to share more than just space. They had started to share their stories, small snippets of their pasts, the things they had lost and the things they had hoped to find. Sarah, in her quiet way, had opened up about her life before she came to the mountains. She told him of the small town she had grown up in, of her dreams and of the man she had once believed she could build a future with. But somewhere along the way, those dreams had shattered, leaving her alone and desperate to escape. For Jake, it was harder to share. His past was buried so deep that even talking about it felt like an effort. But every time he looked at Sarah, he saw someone who was trying to rebuild her life, just like he had once tried to do. And somehow, without even realizing it, he found himself talking about the things that had driven him into the mountains all those years ago. "Did you ever think you'd be here, in a place like this?" Sarah asked one evening as they sat together near the fire, the light from the flames dancing on their faces. Jake thought for a long moment before answering. "No, I never thought I'd find anyone here. I thought I'd always be alone." Sarah nodded, a thoughtful look in her eyes. "I thought the same thing. I thought I could run away from everything, but I ended up running right into another kind of loneliness." The silence between them was comfortable now, as if they had both found some unspoken understanding. For the first time, Jake didn't feel like he was just a man living alone in the wilderness. He felt like he was part of something, part of a story that was still unfolding. And for Sarah, the cabin was no longer just a shelter from the storm. It had become a place of refuge, a place where she could start to heal. Despite the peace that had settled over the cabin, there was still the question of what would happen next. The storm had passed, but Sarah couldn't stay forever. The mountain was a place of isolation, and although Jake had grown comfortable with the quiet, he knew that Sarah needed more than just a safe place to rest. She needed to find a way forward, a new path to follow. One morning, Jake woke early, as he always did, to start the fire and prepare for the day. Sarah was still asleep, curled up in the chair by the window, her breath steady and peaceful. He found himself looking at her for a long time, as if trying to understand what had brought them together. In that moment, he realized how much her presence had changed him. He had always kept his distance from people, convinced that solitude was the only way to keep the pain of his past at bay. But now, with Sarah in the cabin, he had begun to understand that maybe the world wasn't as cold and unforgiving as he had once believed. When Sarah finally woke, she stretched slowly and rubbed her eyes, looking around the cabin as if she was still adjusting to the idea of being there. It had been a few days now, and while the storm had passed, there was still a sense of uncertainty hanging in the air. Jake had always prided himself on his ability to survive, but this was different. This wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about living, about finding a way to move forward even when the path seemed unclear. "I've been thinking," Jake said as Sarah sat up and rubbed her arms, trying to shake off the last remnants of sleep. "The snow's starting to settle. The storm's gone. You can't stay here forever." Sarah looked at him, her face a mix of gratitude and uncertainty. "I know," she said softly. "But where will I go? I don't have anywhere else to turn." Jake paused, his mind racing. He had always been a man of the mountains, content to live alone, untouched by the world outside. But he couldn't deny the fact that Sarah needed more than what he could offer here. She needed a future, a chance to rebuild her life, something he couldn't provide in this isolated corner of the world. "You don't have to decide right now," Jake said, trying to steady his voice. "But there's a town down the mountain. It's not far, but it's far enough. You might find some help there." Sarah's eyes searched his face for a long time, as if weighing his words. Finally, she nodded slowly. Maybe I should go. I don't know what I'm doing here, but I can't stay in this cabin forever." Jake nodded in return, though part of him didn't want her to leave. It wasn't that he didn't want to help. He did more than anything. But there was a part of him that feared being alone again, the way he had been for so long. He had gotten used to the quiet, the stillness, and now, with Sarah's presence in his life, the thought of losing that connection was harder than he'd expected. "I'll help you," Jake said, his voice firm but gentle. "We'll head down tomorrow when the weather clears up some more. You don't have to do this alone." Sarah's eyes softened, a quiet tear slipping down her cheek. She wiped it away quickly, but Jake saw it. He saw the vulnerability that still lingered in her, the fear of the unknown that had followed her here. But there was also something else, a sense of strength, of determination that had brought her to this cabin in the first place. "Thank you," Sarah whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how to repay you." "You saved my life," Jake shook his head. "You don't owe me anything. We both found something here. Maybe that's enough." For the rest of the day, they prepared for the journey ahead. Jake packed what little they needed for the trip, a few supplies, a couple of warm coats, and a blanket to keep Sarah warm. It wasn't a long journey, but the mountain was always unpredictable, and they both knew it could be dangerous. Still, it was a step forward for Sarah, a chance for her to begin again. That night, as they sat together by the fire, there was a sense of peace between them. Neither of them spoke much, but there was no need. They both understood that this was a turning point, a moment when things could change for both of them. Jake had spent years running from his past, hiding in the mountains, but now with Sarah he felt like he had found something worth holding on to. And for Sarah, the cabin had been more than just a place to rest. It had been a refuge, a place where she could start to heal. The next morning the sky was clear and the mountain was bathed in sunlight. The snow had settled and the world seemed calm, almost peaceful. Jake helped Sarah get ready for the journey down, and together they walked out into the cold, stepping into the unknown. But this time, they weren't alone. They had each other, and that was enough for now. As they walked down the mountain side by side, Jake realized that sometimes the most unexpected moments could change everything. He had come to the mountains to escape, but in doing so, he had found something far more important than solitude. He had found a chance at connection, a chance at healing. And that was something he had never expected to find.